Thank you. And thanks, Ambassador Dana, and thanks to all of you for joining this conversation today. We have an especially full agenda, including new content on equity goals, metrics, and tracking. To start, Jess is going to remind us about our process to date and what we've accomplished since our interim equity recommendations report in February. We're going to look briefly together at the outline of the final equity report to the Climate Council and talk about how we've restructured the interim equity recommendations to better align with Maine Won't Wait, the state's climate action plan. We're then going to dig into priority populations, metrics, and tracking. You may remember that our introductory presentation on the equity metrics framework back in March, and you're likely familiar with the indicators that we track as part of Maine Won't Wait. Since our last conversation as a subcommittee, we've revised the interim equity recommendations, bucketed them into equity goals, and proposed equity metrics which align with those existing Maine Won't Wait indicators. We'll look together at a framework to guide the report's considerations of primary populations and our measures of equitable outcomes. Then we're going to spend some time applying the framework to equity goals, actions, and metrics, which we revisited since our last subcommittee meeting. That will be the bulk of the conversation today, led by members of the subcommittees who have been supporting each specific working group of the Climate Council. We'll take a break about halfway through this section. Finally, we're going to wrap up today's meeting by presenting a proposal for the structure of this subcommittee moving forward, and by discussing recommendations for the Climate Council to consider and involve priority populations. Throughout today's meeting, the subcommittee members are welcome to use the chat and raise hand functions when you have questions or comments. We'll pause for discussion after each section, but we're glad to answer any clarifying questions along the way, including via the chat. We'll also encourage you to eat your lunch at any point, given that we scheduled this meeting over the lunch hour. For members of the public who are attending today's meeting, we also invite you to use the chat, but we will not be responding to your comments in real time today. You'll also have an opportunity to provide any feedback after today's meeting until January 6th via a form that Cassie will share in the chat. We'll talk more about this as the meeting progresses. And as already noted, we are recording this meeting and providing the entire slide deck online, along with the recording to enable public comment. So thank you for your continued commitment to this work. And with that, Jess, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Carol, thanks very much. And good morning again, everyone. It's great to see you all. And I'm just so glad to be back together as a subcommittee. Thanks again to members of the public for joining and listening in on a conversation today. I wanted to get us started, just reground us, given that we haven't been together as a subcommittee in some time, with a reminder of where we are in the equity process and what we've been doing since we last met as a full subcommittee. And as we're all aware, the state's climate action plan has a lot of different directives in it, which consider, serve, and invest in vulnerable communities. And we know that all the way back in 2020, equity was considered along with multiple other outcomes during the Climate Council's original climate planning process. But reflecting that the Climate Council was considering multiple objectives, you'll recall that we were established by the Climate Council to center consideration of vulnerable people in climate plan implementation. So the climate plan recommended the formation of the Equity Subcommittee. We started meeting early last year, and we worked together to develop 57 draft equity recommendations, which were grounded really in a thorough review of the existing climate action plan. These recommendations, you'll recall, were presented to the Climate Council in an interim report earlier this year, back in February. And as part of that interim report, the subcommittee, proposed further consideration with further consultation, with the Climate Council working groups. We really knew that we had the opportunity to consult with the working groups to refine and revise our recommendations. And so starting in April, Equity Subcommittee members selected to support sector-specific working groups. Each working group and the Science and Technical Subcommittee met 2 times between April and November this year to consider and to comment on the subcommittee's interim recommendations. At the same time and in parallel, my team and I held consultations with state agencies and others to learn about equity actions already underway and really to think about the development of equity metrics. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, kind of the consultations and conversations we've been having in parallel to our work together. And we've taken really all of this input and examples of actions underway to refine and restructure our interim equity recommendations to shape them into goals and recommended actions that align quite closely with Maine Won't Wait. But as you know, the Equity Subcommittee was also charged with developing metrics to help monitor equitable climate plan implementation, really to help us understand how and where climate actions and investments are serving priority populations and communities. And so to help us develop metrics, we worked with a consultant, Amanda Dwelly, whom introduced herself at the beginning of this meeting. Amanda has deep expertise in monitoring and evaluating equity outcomes across these types of programs, and she'll talk a little bit more about equity metrics in a few minutes. So where do we go after today? Just to give us a sense of kind of the continued runway for this work. As Carol mentioned, we are intending to have a public comment period after today's meeting, and the Equity Subcommittee will also receive the full draft report for review. We'll come back together at the end of January to discuss any public comments, to talk more about meaningful involvement in procedural equity, and to hopefully adopt our report to submit to the Climate Council. Upon that kind of motion, the Climate Council will then consider our final recommendations at their meeting early next year. So that's kind of the process, kind of looking back in history and going forward from today. And let's go ahead and go, great, thanks, to this next slide. Because before we look at the outline of what that final body of work looks like, I wanted to really acknowledge and raise up the role that both members of the public and the impacted state agencies have played in helping finalize this report. As you'll recall, we conducted a pretty robust and geographically diverse stakeholder process last year, getting feedback on our interim recommendations. This process included creating a plain language version of our recommendations, and we took them really into conversation in each of our communities led by different subcommittee members. This year, we've continued gathering feedback, really focusing deeply on each of the Climate Council's working groups. We met with each working group once to discuss actions and once to discuss priority populations and metrics. And all of those meetings were public, many of which had time for public comments. We really appreciate, again, members of the public continuing to participate throughout this process. As I mentioned, in between those two rounds of working group meetings, though, I met with all of the agencies listed here on the slides, and I probably missed a few agencies or programs that we did meet with. But these are all agencies that were kind of implicated by the subcommittee's recommended equity actions. Agencies were able to share examples of work underway. Some of that work has substantively met our original equity recommendations, and they really helped us identify revisions to our original recommendations that I think are very helpful, that help us key in on those opportunities for equitable action. And so if we go to the next slide, Cassie, I'll just say that all of this helped shape and improve the draft equity report that we're discussing today. And I wanted to just provide a little bit of an overview of this broader body of work that will accompany the equity recommendations in our final report. As we mentioned in our overview, the report will start by identifying priority populations for climate action and a framework for metrics and tracking. This is what we're talking about in the next section of this morning's agenda. The report will then follow the chapter structure of Maine Won't Wait, with the intention that our equity goals, actions, and indicators align with existing Maine Won't Wait strategies. In most instances, the equity goals nest underneath existing Maine Won't Wait strategies, and the metrics nest underneath Maine Won't Wait progress indicators, a structure that we'll talk about as we proceed through our content during this meeting. The report is also intending to lay out some cross-cutting recommendations for public engagement. These are recommendations that we've been calling procedural equity recommendations, which really focus on opportunities to consider and involve people in planning and decision-making across all state climate and clean energy processes. We're going to talk about these procedural equity recommendations at our final meeting together in January, though we did share that chapter that contains the recommendations with the Equity Subcommittee representatives who were reviewing chapters in advance of today. And the report may also list some information gaps, including baseline studies and benchmarks that the next climate action planning process could consider. Ultimately, though, it's important to remember that our subcommittee was tasked with developing equity outcome indicators and metrics, as well as with making those recommendations to equitably implement our climate action plan. And so similar to the metrics that we monitor to understand our overall climate actions, we want some tools to measure progress towards our equity goals. So the report now identifies metrics to track and in some instances to report as part of our climate implementation process. I just, substantively in summary here, this final report really builds on our equity interim recommendations. It provides helpful revisions and identifies opportunities to better serve priority populations. And it's really structurally aligned with Maine Won't Wait and has undergone really significant review by implementing partners. I'm really proud of this body of work that we have the opportunity to bring back to you. Wanted to again thank all of you for continuing to participate in this process and help develop this work along the way. I'm going to stop there and see if any subcommittee members have questions about our equity process so far before we turn into our first content section this morning. Let's try to hold content related questions until a little bit later in our meeting, but any process related questions to begin with.
Not seeing any, Jess.
Okay. Super, happy to take any kind of clarifying procedural questions in the chat as well, and encourage equity subcommittee members to chime in. Use your raised hand function or just come off of mute and we'll keep an eye out. So then let's move on and introduce a framework for thinking about priority populations and how we might track progress towards reaching and serving priority populations through equity metrics. For those of you who received draft chapters in advance of this meeting, this section of our presentation summarizes the chapter you reviewed on priority populations metrics and tracking. I'm going to hand this section over to our consultant, Amanda Dwelly, who I mentioned a few times has been helping our team restructure the equity report and really define those goals and equity metrics. Amanda will walk us through this framework, which then applies to each of the chapters that we'll talk about as really the body of our meeting today. So starting with the framework, I'll just turn it over to Amanda and we can go to our next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, and good morning, everyone. So yes, I'll start with a review of the priority populations that you really identified throughout your interim recommendations. These are the people, communities, and businesses we need to consider and involve in climate and clean energy planning and implementation. And also at the core of the tracking, we'll need to set up and report to understand equity. And we can think of the priority populations you identified in three groups. The first is individuals and households. And nearly all of the recommendations, you prioritize low-income people and households. And some recommendations also consider other characteristics like employment status, health, mobility, housing, energy burden, depending on the sector. For example, renters may be considered in many of the housing or energy recommendations, and there are other groups detailed in the draft chapter. Second, the subcommittee prioritized at least one type of community or community characteristic for nearly all recommendations, including low-income, rural communities, disadvantaged communities, and frontline communities, and sometimes multiple factors. And we'll talk about more of these communities in a minute. And finally, some recommendations relate to economic and workforce development, where priority populations could be workers and businesses in natural resource industries, or in clean energy and energy efficiency, and in some cases, small minority women or veteran-owned businesses. And taking a look at the considerations on the right, hearing this list and thinking back to your work, you can probably think of cases where not everyone in a particular priority population or community may be vulnerable or under-resourced. Not all people and communities face the same vulnerabilities or barriers accessing climate programs and funds. So rather, we, as you did, think about equitable climate action as that which considers and addresses multiple or intersecting vulnerabilities. So we can take, for an example, older adults. Some may live in housing or remote conditions that's more vulnerable to flooding or natural disasters. So they might be prioritized differently in hazard mitigation efforts, while others in other locations may not face the same impacts, but might have different barriers around income, access to health, or mobility affecting other climate actions. Thinking about communities, the Equity Subcommittee discussed a lot of different risks and vulnerabilities. For some strategies, the state could focus on rural or low-income communities facing particular climate change or economic risks, while for other recommendations, they could think about local or regional planning staff or capacity, for example, capacity to find or apply for grants. Many of your recommendations are for programs that already have existing eligibility criteria, including federal guidelines, like the Heating Assistance Program or Low-Income Assistance Program. Since these programs might already follow state or federal guidelines, such as different thresholds of low-income households or different definitions of rural communities, the report is not going to really provide very specific criteria or thresholds to allow agencies to align their priority populations and thresholds with any federal or state guidelines already in place. And a little bit more about tracking. We do know it's not possible for state agencies to identify or track all of these populations or how each population might interact with different programs. So the report will provide a longer list of priority populations to consider and involve in actions, and then really talk about a subset of populations as priorities for tracking and metrics. However, we do want to note that even without data to identify or reach specific people, programs and state processes can still be designed to consider and involve them. And this really gets back to the idea of meaningful involvement in planning and decision making. And let's move on to the next slide. And let's just dig into communities for a minute. In many recommendations, the subcommittee prioritized at least one of these 4 types of communities, maybe using these terms, maybe using other terms, getting to the same idea. Many climate and energy programs already prioritize low-income or rural communities, though we do know that specific criteria and thresholds, even for low-income and rural communities, could vary based on federal or state guidelines. The terms disadvantaged and frontline communities have been used by several state and federal programs, and that's why we're kind of using this term disadvantaged communities here, but it can represent different things. Typically, disadvantaged communities are thought to or defined as those that face multiple or intersecting burdens, including economic, environmental, or health vulnerabilities. With a slight difference, thinking about frontline communities, where climate is considered a little bit more in that term. Frontline communities are those facing the first and worst impacts of climate change, considering both their climate and socioeconomic vulnerability. Frontline communities are not yet defined at a state level, but could include natural resource industry dependent communities such as fishing communities or other characteristics getting to their risk or vulnerability to climate change. And in general, Maine hasn't established definitive criteria for some of these terms or list of communities, though there are numerous federal and state screening tools to help look at and identify these communities. And federal guidelines like Justice 40 are already working to help ensure that benefits for climate and clean energy spending are flowing to disadvantaged communities. So understanding the variety of criteria that may be in use, the final report is not going to provide specific criteria or thresholds for these community types, again, to allow agencies and program implementers to establish or align these definitions with their programs. So holding those priority populations in mind, we'll tie things together in a minute. Let's move into the overall framework for thinking about metrics. And in this section, the next set of slides is really about equity outcome metrics, and that's highlighted on the right. And these are really who benefits from Maine's climate actions, who participates or receives funding, where investments or infrastructure upgrades occur, and really whether that's a fair share. So these outcome metrics will really measure the combined outcome of all state actions and investments to serve all of Maine's people and communities. And while we're going to talk about metrics tied to equity recommendations, I do want to acknowledge here these metrics are really the outcomes of multiple state and partner efforts, including the years of work you and the state has already done and changes you're making to reach and serve more people. So not only might they be, across state and program actions, they're also across both the recommendations in your report and the work underway, which is also acknowledged in the report. And looking at actions tracking and monitoring metrics on the left, Jess will talk more about these later with examples, but I'll just highlight how they fit into the framework. Actions tracking is simply keeping track of whether and when the state is implementing some of the processes and recommendations in the equity report. And these are more procedural, things like changing or adopting a policy procedure or making changes to an existing program that could be tracked more on a yes/no basis. And in the middle, the report will provide some monitoring metrics to help planners and program staff see if actions are really gaining traction. And these are a way to find intermediate indicators to see if things are on track. So measuring things like access or applications, or the location of things like EV charging stations, and could also include baseline studies or data on the current distribution of services. So I'll continue this section talking about equity metrics, and later, as you see metrics tied to specific goals, Jess will detail some of the actions tracking and monitoring metrics. All right, so moving on, here on the left, you see the progress indicators that are part of Maine Won't Wait. These are really the basis for the proposed equity outcome metrics so that we can really tie together equity tracking with the structure of Maine Won't Wait. The Climate Action Plan contains 11 statewide indicators to determine if the state's on track to reach overall energy resilience, economic, and jobs goals. And two things to note here as you look through these. These really emphasize the benefits that Maine people and communities experience on the ground from Maine's actions and investments. Things like energy savings, heat pumps, broadband, jobs, spending on infrastructure and other projects, which can have direct and also indirect local benefits. Also, another thing to notice, you look through these are generally overall statewide metrics, like the total number of EVs, the total number of heat pumps in the state. And I do want to note here, the state might not have comprehensive data on some of these yet, but they're tracking many of them in annual updates to the Climate Council. So thinking about the overall nature of these things, really the big question for equity is whether these climate actions and spending are reaching disadvantaged frontline or otherwise vulnerable people, communities, and businesses. And to do this, the state needs to know where actions are happening geographically and who is benefiting. Looking at these indicators, nearly all of them could be broken down further by location or by demographic or economic characteristics of participating people or businesses. So the equity outcome metrics are really meant to build on the Maine Won't Wait indicators to give the Climate Council and the state a way to understand how Maine's climate actions are considering, involving, and benefiting people and communities. So let's get into that a little bit more and look at two parts of that and how this could translate into metrics and tracking. Thinking about location first on the left, this is basically considering where a project or investment occurs to understand whether projects, participation, or spending are serving low-income, rural, disadvantaged, or frontline communities. Numerous equity metrics that you'll see consider these community types or characteristics so that we can look across state programs and actions to say what percentage of projects participants are spending occurred in priority communities. For example, for infrastructure and resilience grants, we might want to know whether frontline or rural communities are applying for or receiving funding. Are they applying for or receiving funding at the same or greater levels as other communities? And then let's take a look at the right side of the page, which is about who is participating or benefiting. And these are mainly for programs that serve people or households on an individual basis, including housing and energy programs, energy assistance, and workforce initiatives in climate impacted industries. Again, our question here is whether priority populations are participating or benefiting at a similar or higher rate compared with other populations. We might want to understand what percentage of projects participants are spending are reaching low-income people or households or businesses. For example, are low-income households participating or benefiting at the same or higher rate as non-low-income households? And income is just one example. A few other characteristics are recommended for tracking in other sectors, like housing, energy, or workforce development. For example, for workforce development, we might want to know about funding for climate impacted or natural resource industry workers. And I do want to say a key part of equity metrics tracking is measuring not only the share of projects or funding going to a priority population or community, but also knowing how much of the state is in that population or group. And we're using the term benchmarking to think about this. And this is really the idea of comparing or benchmarking participation or spending to priority populations to a statewide share. So comparing something like the percentage of low-income people benefiting from a program to the percentage of low-income households in the state. And while the report will not set specific goals or benchmarks in the report, it will include some data sources and potential benchmarks for these populations and communities in an appendix for agencies and programs to use to understand how these metrics line up with populations and communities in the state. And I do want to note also that benchmarking is a critical first step in understanding the distribution of climate benefits to priority populations. It's not the same as setting equity goals, which would establish a level of investment that's considered equitable. However, we do need these data benchmarks across programs and recommendations in order to build up to that step. So let's take a look at the last slide in this section. To give you a sense of what aggregate reporting for equity outcome metrics could look like. So these equity outcome metrics are really not meant to create a scorecard of what each specific program is doing on its own, but rather to indicate whether the combined result of the state's climate actions and programs are reaching priority populations and communities. The existing Maine won't wait indicators, as you saw, actually do the same. They roll up the combined result of state climate and energy actions and outcomes across multiple programs. Equity outcome metrics can take a similar approach, rolling up data across programs and agencies if relevant, to show an overall result across multiple funding streams or programs. However, just to get these aggregate results, agencies might still need to track data at the household, community, and program level. And this might mean coding or assigning participation or spending to a town or census tract in the case of community metrics to characterize it as low-income, rural, disadvantaged, or frontline, or also figuring out who is low to moderate income, if that's a relevant population or metric. Thinking about income, we know there are many different ways to assess income level and different criteria and thresholds for different programs, to align with federal criteria. As I mentioned earlier, the idea is for programs and agencies to be able to define and track low income or other priority populations in line with their state or federal guidelines. Some programs already do this if they assess or screen for income eligibility, while others, if they are working with this population, could ask about eligibility or enrollment in other state or federal benefits, pursuant to guidelines we have about confidentiality and data governance. And I do also want to note another concept of this aggregate reporting is, there won't be any requirement to report any individual or confidential data to the Climate Council. Agencies and partners can roll up information and report in aggregate. And I'll stop here and turn it back to Carol and Jess for questions.
Thanks, Amanda. I want to thank those who are dropping questions and feedback into the chat. We are tracking all of that and we'll be responding to them at a later time. In the meantime, any clarifying questions from anyone about what Amanda just covered?
And great.
Anya?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. So I guess just a clarifying question on the metrics. I understand like the need to give flexibility on determining those metrics, and just wondering, is there going to be like formal ways that this committee moving forward will be able to like analyze those metrics from agencies? I'm just wondering like how the balance between like holding agencies accountable to our recommendations and then also giving them the flexibility to make it work for their programs. Wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
Anya, thanks. As we propose right now, there are 3 stages of metrics. There's kind of the yes/no tracking with action. So these monitoring metrics that are really meant to let programs assess whether or not they're on track. And there are equity outcome metrics, which we've aligned specifically with the Maine weight indicators, and which we intend to report on in the same way that we report on the Maine weight indicators in annual reports. So that information is really meant to be transparent and accountable in achieving equity outcomes, assuming that that's the way this body of work continues to move forward. And so the thresholds for various definitions will all have to be part of that reporting, right? It's not, you can't just say I'm serving low-income people and not define whom those folks are or whom households are. I think that when we talk later in the meeting about the role of this committee moving forward, certainly we were directed to help monitor progress and really help kind of keep track of equitable achievement of our climate action plan. And so I do think that the proposal shared towards the end of this deck, and that we'll talk about a little bit later, does provide opportunities for the Equity Subcommittee to continue doing that work in partnership with the working groups. So yes, and yes, I hope are the 2 answers to your questions.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other clarifying questions for now? Hi, Fortunat.
Hi. Yeah, Amanda noted that benchmarking is not the same thing as setting equity goals, and so I just wanted some clarification around sort of what the process is for setting equity goals. I worry a little bit about, as soon as you start showing sort of the bars next to each other against the benchmark, you start to imagine that as being the goal, and I think we would agree that's probably insufficient compared to what we're trying to do.
Fortunate, thanks. I think this is a conversation that we've had a lot as an equity subcommittee. And part of why there's a lot of proposal of benchmarks here is because we haven't collectively collected data like this before. We don't really know across many of our programs how those programs are serving the priority populations that this subcommittee has identified. And so we're very clear in the draft report, and I think that this is reflective of language that we had in our interim report as well, that benchmarking is not the same as goal setting, that goal setting is based on data. What we hope, right, is that we've done a lot of work and consulted with so many people, but specifically with the working groups as well, that in the next climate action planning process, we've provided quite a lot of tools and access to conversation and ideas that will help the next climate action planning process really keep equity front of mind as well as one, of course, of multiple objectives that it's considering. I would imagine that it would be possible for, as we're revisiting our climate action plan and climate action thresholds, to consider, are the goals that we've set for ourselves at a statewide level appropriate? Do they take into account equity? Are they serving priority populations? So I do think that this is a starting point. This work is still the beginning of a conversation with the Climate Council, but it is intended to continue. We don't just stop with this final report and say, that's that, we've done it. So I think there's opportunity again, but that language is, that distinction is clear, I think, in the proposed final report.
Any other clarifying questions for now? This will probably all come into better focus as we move through the sections. So if we might look at the PowerPoint slides again.
Actually, I see Jason.
Oh,
put his
I'm
hand
sorry.
up.
Jason, hi.
Hi, Carol. Sorry about that. As you were just saying, as we move into the sections, I wanted to make sure if we were moving into the sections that I just made a comment on one of my notes from priority populations. I was pleased that we added some priority populations based upon some of the conversations that we had. I was concerned in one particular incident, and I thought I might have voiced this in the past, that we became greatly inclusive in terms of the different types of renters, homeowners, if you will. But I did find that we were a little exclusive of homeowners. And as I think I stated, in many parts of rural Maine, including here in Aroostook County, many homeowners are more low-income residents, that is what they're able to afford compared to a rental situation. And I know this, like, we were inclusive with mobile homes, but we actually have a number of folks up here in Aroostook County who are snowbirds who choose to have a mobile home up here to live in the summer. So it doesn't necessarily denote that they're low income. So I just want to be concerned that when we're pointing out priority populations, I think there are other areas and ways of covering to ensure that low income homeowners get in, but I just found that was missing from my perspective in terms of almost exclusively missing from the conversation because of all of the other coverage that was noted. The other thing that I noted in that priority population section, and I repeat it also in in relation to chapter or section 3, is my ongoing concern with, even though we have a lot of things to mitigate this, the geographic area and community about how we're going to sort of work around those small towns with limited bandwidth. And I still remain concerned, and I do so, and there was reference to broadband, and I'm on broadband committees as well, and I'm expressing the same concern there, that even with providing all of the technical assistance and the urging and the encouragement that's listed here, that sometimes it's just a matter of the political will and taking advantage of that. And I'm still hopeful that we have opportunities for work around, and I'm starting to see that on the broadband side here in Aroostook County as it relates to more regional support for that, so that smaller communities aren't left out because of belief system issues or other things of rural leaders, and that it's more inclusive as opposed to exclusive, and that politics don't play a role in that. So those are my two comments as it relates to that component of the report.
Thank you, Jason. I don't know, Jess, if there's any comment you want to make. No, just duly noted.
No, that's great. No, thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
I think we'll be clear. Absolutely, that intersectionality between low income, and we focus on it a lot between low income and rentals, but it's certainly not meant to be exclusive of households of homeowners as well. And similarly with your second comment. So thank you for that detailed feedback. And we'll continue, of course, to invite the Equity Subcommittee members to provide feedback on any of this work, kind of to comment in on the chapters, and you'll also get the full body of work from beginning to end for review a little bit later after this meeting. So lots of opportunities to keep chiming in.
Yeah, thanks. And Jason, your point just reminds me of the importance of us being nuanced in our explanation. So we're not generalizing to the point of defeating our own commitment. So thank you. With that, I think I'll move us along. Cassie, if we might have the slide deck, thank you. So we're now going to be looking together at the revised recommendations that make up our draft final report. Jess, you and the team have spent a lot of time really working on these draft chapters that you reviewed, pulled together examples, content, research, and making revisions to actions underway and actions that we recommend going forward. Everyone has worked with Amanda and with the state agencies to understand what's possible and practical to study, to implement and to track, and have realigned the whole body of work to track with the Maine Won't Wait report. And they've applied the framework that we just discussed to each sector of the equity recommendations. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Jess, in just a minute, and you are going to walk us through the equity goals, actions, and metrics that fit into each chapter. We're going to be using Chapter A about clean transportation as an example, and we're going to look at priority populations and then consider new equity goals, which summarize recommendations that we discussed together earlier this year. Our recommended actions nest under each goal, and equity metrics, both for monitoring progress and measuring outcomes, nest under each goal as well. We'll review all of the content for Chapter A, and then we're going to ask you, Jonathan Rubin and Matt Marks, who selected to report the Climate Council's Transportation Working Group earlier this year, to provide feedback, essentially focusing on these three questions that we have here in the slide. Are these goals, actions, and metrics meaningful? Do they address the barriers for priority populations? And will they ensure shared benefits for Maine's people and communities? For the remainder of the chapters after this example of Chapter A, we're going to do a much shorter presentation of content, looking only at the goals and metrics together. However, we hope you've had a chance to review the deck and that you have the full deck somewhere that's accessible to you right now. I think, Cassie, you've already put that in the chat, and we want you to be able to be looking at that in case you need it, and for members of the public as well. Jess will briefly summarize each chapter, open the floor to feedback from those of you supporting the relevant working group, and then we can have a conversation about any specific questions you might have as you flip through the action recommendation slides on your own. I think this approach that we spent a lot of time developing, how to get through an extraordinary amount of dense information in a timely fashion. We hope this approach will become clear to you, and you'll see how we're going to do that. And with that, Jess, I think let's get going and give it a go.
All right, super. Thanks, Carol. And like I said, we're going to start. I'll just give just a couple of introductory slides, and then we'll jump into Chapter A and do that whole chapter nuts to bolts so that we understand really how the flow of these chapters and content fit together. But I wanted to remind us all just one more time about a snapshot of how our equity recommendations nest under the strategies in Maine Won't Wait. As you know, there are 8 strategies in Maine Won't Wait, ranging from clean transportation to engaging Maine's peoples and communities. We'll talk about the first 7 of them today. We're going to save that engagement chapter for our conversation about procedural equity at our next meeting, as those 2 bodies of work really dovetail nicely together. So each strategy in Maine Won't Wait, you'll recall, contains between 1 to 5 overarching recommendations, and each of those recommendations in our climate action plan have recommended actions detailed in each chapter. For the equity report, content has been reorganized in exactly the same way following the strategies in Maine Won't Wait. Each strategy contained within its own equity chapter also contains 1 to 3 equity goal statements, each of which have recommended actions and metrics detailed in each chapter. In many instances, we found that our equity goal statements really restate the original Maine Won't Wait recommendations, but they identify a priority population or a priority community for focused intervention. In fewer instances, our equity goal statements establish a new recommendation, something that we identified in our review of Maine Won't Wait was kind of a gap, something that the Climate Action Plan had not had time or bandwidth to consider in its original go-around. So if we move to the next slide, just to remind us that in addition to the goals and recommended actions, which we're going to talk about a lot today, each chapter will also have a lot more content about equity in each sector as an introduction, including talking about priority populations that are specific to that sector's programs. And we'll have lists and recognition of work underway or completed by the state, just so that we understand kind of what our recommendations are building on top of. And of course, each chapter will contain metrics and tracking. These recommended actions are what we're most familiar with. They align most closely with our interim recommendations. They are what have been refined based on public feedback over the course of the past 2 years, based on survey responses from each of the Climate Council's working groups. based on agency interviews and based on conversations, of course, with all of you. One thing that I think it's important to note is that during the preparation of the final report, we really tried to stay within the bounds of what this subcommittee recommended through your year-long process in 2021. We didn't bring up any entirely new ideas, even some of the ideas or recommendations that working groups offered in the meetings over the course of this past year. We also removed just a couple of recommendations that are out of scope for the climate action plan. And also we removed actions that we've learned are underway or completed, but we've reported on the completion of those actions as part of the introduction of each chapter. And during our discussion about the material today, I think we should keep in mind kind of these same frameworks, sticking first to the scope of our original recommendations, which means that while it's entirely appropriate to identify new ideas or opportunities for further work, we'll put those in the parking lot as part of today's conversations, and we'll reference them in an appendix to this report saying, hey, here's a whole body of work that the Climate Council could consider in its next climate action planning process. And then the second thing that we'll just keep in mind is staying within the scope of the climate action plan, which means that kind of our area of jurisdiction, for lack of a better word, is state agencies and state agency partners. That's what the climate action plan, while it's inspired a ton of action, a ton of local leadership all around the state, its jurisdiction is really looking in at the state and the programs and processes that we run. So we'll try to keep in mind that area of jurisdiction. We'll try to keep in mind aligning with our original interim recommendations together. And we'll certainly have a place to take and focus in on any additional feedback that you have to provide as we walk through the chapters. So with that, let's jump into transportation. We're going to walk through each of the topics contained here on the slide and end with time for conversation before we move to our next chapter. And we'll start with priority populations, which, as Amanda mentioned, in her overview, can vary per sector. Specifically, the barriers faced by priority populations accessing specific types of programs absolutely differ depending on the types of programs those are. So in this sector, our transportation recommendations are really meant to address barriers to participation in and access to clean transportation opportunities and funding. For individuals and households, those barriers might include, but are not limited to, income and housing type. We do focus in on renters whose landlords may not have an incentive to install EV charging, but certainly we don't exclude low-income homeowners who also don't have access to capital, for example, to install EV charging at home. People with limited physical mobility or without access to reliable transportation, and people who rely on public transportation as their main means of getting around are also priority populations in this chapter. Priority communities include those who face barriers like geographic isolation or folks who may live in sparsely populated rural areas, which makes some of our current public transportation options unsustainable. Priority communities may also include low-income communities who might have limited resources for investment in transportation infrastructure, and they certainly include areas with higher exposure to transportation emissions. I think it's important to keep in mind that for all of our chapters, we acknowledge that not all individuals in these groups face equal risks or vulnerabilities, and we acknowledge that we certainly haven't captured the entire universe of people who may face barriers to accessing clean transportation programs. Therefore, continuously across all of our chapters, we encourage state agencies, partners, and stakeholders to further assess priority populations to really drill into whom is most vulnerable, whom can best be served by these sorts of programs. So let's go ahead then and look at the equity goals for Chapter A. I'm going to give you a minute just to read through these 3 goals, which you will see are fairly high-level statements. They serve to summarize a subsequent set of recommended actions, which we'll talk about together. So we're going to look at each goal individually, but I'll just stop talking for a minute so you can read them here. All right, let's dig in and start with goal 1. And what we have on this slide is a lot of text. I really encourage you, look at this on your kind of adjacent slide deck, look at this separately, and please dig in during and after this meeting. But this contains an equity goal. The associated actions are associated recommendations that nest under that goal, and both types of metrics, monitoring and equity outcome metrics. Remember that in the full chapters, each of these goals are accompanied by a robust accounting of work underway. So in some cases, our equity action recommendations are incremental. They build on that existing work underway, which is documented in each chapter. So as we look at the first equity goal for Chapter A, it reads to increase EV ownership amongst low to moderate income households, renters, and multifamily renters in low and moderate income households in rural areas, really identifying both priority populations and priority communities. We'll refer to low and moderate income as LMI probably throughout the course of much of the rest of this morning's meeting. Afternoon now, congratulations, we've made it to noon, folks. Our recommendations, which nest underneath this goal, include expanding EV rebate opportunities and locations. This includes both increasing the used vehicle EV rebate and increasing the number of dealerships offering rebates in rural areas. Other recommended actions include engaging with low-income drivers to better understand barriers to accessing existing vehicle rebate programs, really to help understand these forthcoming federal tax incentives and barriers to accessing those. We recommend enhancing financing options and decreasing vehicle purchase costs for low and moderate income drivers. This could include options like assessing a loan loss reserve or assessing potential tax incentives for new and used electric and plug-in vehicles for qualified low-income customers. Again, we have our eye on the massive federal opportunities in this space and ensuring that those are accessible to folks who we've identified as priority populations. And finally, we recommend establishing baseline data on electric vehicle availability, the ability to purchase, and access to financing for low and moderate income individuals and households. We really need this baseline data to better understand access to vehicles across the state, the number of drivers who might need access to lower cost financing, and the relative costs of purchasing and operating an electric vehicle for low-income households, amongst other data that we recommend establishing. So as we think about those actions nested underneath this goal, let's turn to the right side of the slide and talk through metrics. We always start with the existing Maine moat weight indicator that aligns with this goal. That Maine moat weight indicator at a statewide level is the number of electric vehicles on the road. The equity outcome metric, which is meant to align with this existing Maine moat weight indicator, is the number and percentage of electric vehicles owned or leased by low and moderate income households or individuals. We recognize that we probably can't collect information like this through registration records. It's just not the right mechanism. And so we propose as a proxy the number of EV rebates accessed by low and moderate income drivers. This metric is meant to capture the overall progress and access to clean personal vehicles among priority populations. Especially when we consider federal funding, there's absolutely more than one player, absolutely more than one pathway helping low and moderate income drivers access clean transportation. And for progress reporting, we care much more about how many low and moderate income drivers have an EV than what specific program helped them get it. We also include here some monitoring metrics meant to be intermediate indicators. As Amanda mentioned, these are things like awareness or access or applications or possibly the geographic distribution of program benefits. Monitoring metrics are meant to help us understand whether we're on track towards reaching our equity outcomes. So monitoring metrics for this goal include geographic distribution of EV rebates and ownership. That could be per capita, it could be per county, but really thinking about how they're distributed geographically. And also geographic distribution of dealers participating in the rebate program. If you can't buy a car from your local dealer because they don't participate in the program, then that's a barrier to accessing it, particularly for folks who live in rural, geographically isolated areas. So that is a full package of a goal, actions, monitoring metrics, and equity outcome metrics. I'm going to do that 2 more times for each of the other 2 goals in this section. And we'll then kind of pause and open up for conversation led by Jonathan and Matt. So stick with me while we go to the second goal for Chapter A, which is to increase EV charging availability amongst the same priority populations. The actions associated with this goal are to first expand EV charging locations, particularly though developing enhanced program strategies, rebates, or other funding opportunities for chargers that serve rental or multifamily properties or other housing serving low and moderate income residents, and establishing baseline data on the availability of and funding spent on EV charging by housing type and geography, including a strong focus on rural communities. You'll see data collection efforts show up a lot as recommendations from the subcommittee, recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, in many instances, we don't have good baseline data upon which to make decisions or establish further equity goals. Turning to metrics, there isn't a Maine moat indicator that aligns with EV charging, but our general understanding, and I hope this makes sense, is that broad and accessible EV charging supports and accelerates EV ownership. And so therefore our goal here, our goal of expanding access to EV charging is really related to this goal of getting folks into EVs, getting folks into cleaner, more reliable vehicles. And so our equity outcome metric remains the same here. It really looks at that pattern of EV ownership, that accessibility of EV ownership across low and moderate income households. As an intermediate indicator, however, to monitor progress, we've proposed a similar measure as the last goal of tracking where funding and projects are happening, with a particular emphasis on priority populations that face intersecting vulnerabilities. Here's one of the instances where we really call out low-income renters and look to track the geographic distribution of multi-unit dwellings, of non-residential and public charging stations and funding, including proximity to affordable housing, both naturally occurring and state funded. So we're going to do one more. Everybody take a deep breath. We're going to look together at the third goal in Chapter A, which focuses on all of those really important transportation options beyond owning a personal vehicle. This goal reads, expand access to affordable, efficient, and safe, active, shared, and public transportation for lower moderate income people, for non-drivers, and for other disadvantaged populations, particularly in rural areas. We've really crammed a lot into that goal and have the chance to then talk about actions that nest underneath this goal. Those actions include piloting innovative clean transit programs in disadvantaged communities. That could include things like expanding access to existing programs like Go Maine. It could include developing first mile or last mile connections, ride to wellness or recovery, and job access ride pilot programs. We see some of this work already underway from the Department of Transportation. We also recommend developing and launching public educational campaigns which communicate both the benefits of, but also which address hesitancy to use shared public and active transportation. We think that these educational campaigns should include information about the health impacts of transportation choices, particularly for non-drivers. And finally, we recommend publishing transit and active transportation baseline data, which is generated already by many Department of Transportation transit studies, really putting that all in a single accessible location for communities so that they can help identify locally appropriate and responsive shared and active transportation solutions. This goal and its outcomes are associated with the goal in Chapter A of Maine Moat Weight about public transit funding per capita, which, while not strictly an indicator that we track as a climate action plan outcome, does help us get to equity outcome metrics. So the equity outcome metric here is to track clean transit program spending and location by community type. Again, we're identifying a priority population to focus on for a goal that already exists in Maine Moat Weight. The intermediate indicators to monitor progress is the use of shared transit or active transportation by location and rider characteristics. This monitoring metric is really related to the goal of expanded access, thinking about for whom and where does public transportation options both exist and are they palatable? All right, 2 more slides before we move into discussion. Thanks for sticking with us. Many of our chapters conclude by identifying a baseline study, some of which are also recommended actions. For this chapter, we reflect that we don't have a lot of comprehensive statewide data about barriers to purchasing clean vehicles, which makes it hard for us to design truly targeted program interventions. We include collecting this data as our final recommendation in this chapter. And so if we look together at a summary of the chapter on the next slide, we have 3 goals. We have around 10 recommended actions, and we have 2 overall equity outcome metrics. We also have 4 monitoring metrics to help look at progress over time. With that full bundle of information, we now want to open the floor for conversation. As a reminder, many subcommittee members selected to support a sector-specific working group earlier this year. That's how we've been functioning as an equity subcommittee. We've been participating in the meetings that those working groups have held about our interim recommendations. And so in support of this kind of disaggregated participation, we've shared sector-specific chapter drafts with the 2 or 3 subcommittee members supporting each working group, and ask them to be prepared to kick off each conversation, each kind of piece of feedback. So for this chapter, Jonathan Rubin and Matt Marks are supporting the transportation content. So I'm going to invite them to share their feedback in just a minute. But we did start by asking each of you to address these 3 questions. And I wanted to say just a few words about these 3 questions. These really come directly from the charge given to this subcommittee by the Climate Council. We, of course, invite any other feedback that you have as well. And after Jonathan and Matt get us started, we'll open the floor to hear from other subcommittee members. For members of the public, just one more reminder, you'll be able to submit comments after this meeting on the same content and on all of the content from the remaining chapters in this report. So please jot your thoughts down to contribute to that process. You're absolutely welcome to drop them in the chat as you see fit. But I think I'll turn it over to Jonathan and Matt to get us started with feedback on this chapter. And I open it to you.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'll try to be brief here. Can you, first off, this is a lot of work and it's really hard. There is a natural tension here between collecting the most precise, best data, the cost of collecting that data, privacy. And so these are balancing acts. This is not an absolute here. And I'd also say something as simple as you think of counting jobs is not so simple, because are you talking full-time equivalent jobs, part-time jobs, number of people employed, the quality of those jobs? So one of the recommendations is that across all the sectors, really, we have to be using consistent metrics. And it sounds simple, but from practice and years of doing this, I can assure you that it's not always consistently reported across housing, transportation, energy. Those things are really important to get right. So with those preliminaries, I'll say a few thoughts. One is I strongly support most of the recommendations here. I have a few specific things I'd like to call out. One is on the priority populations slide. It says communities and geographic areas. And one of the areas on, I believe this is slide 18 that was called out, is priority populations. It says areas with high transportation emission exposure. And I believe that this recommendation should be broadened to be not areas with high transportation emission exposure, but areas that have lots of emissions regardless of the source. Now, I believe that this was probably colored by EPA, federal and state reporting things that look sector by sector. But if you think about a low-income person in a city, say South Portland, near the oil terminals, we don't care that those oil terminals, we don't care, presumably from a health perspective, where the emissions are coming from. We want to prioritize them regardless the fact that the emissions may be coming from a non-transportation source, those populations. So I recommend a wider look at communities of particular impact. Again, looking at the monitoring metrics of, and for goal 1, it says geographic distribution of EV rebates, owners, and per capita by county. Now, there's a lot of heterogeneity. I've looked at the data. I published some of this data. You can go on my Market Chase Smith Policy Center and you can search transportation in my name and you'll get some reports. There's a lot of heterogeneity in rural and urban areas, both in terms of income. And so I think that we really need to do is we need to track the distribution of EV rebates by person, not by sort of a grosser area. Now you say to me, well, Jonathan, how do we do this? I would say a simple way that is done elsewhere, California in particular, is a voluntary survey application at the time that you get that rebate. It's opt-in, it's not comprehensive, but we want to know who these people are. It would be misleading to say, well, here's a low-income census tract, but it goes to a high-income person who just happens to live in that low-income census tract. That's not what we're trying to measure. So I think we need to be more precise in some of that to the extent that we can, given the cost of gathering that data and some concerns about privacy. So that's one thing that I think needs refinement. And then I'll say a couple more on baseline studies, and then I'll let Matt talk, which is, I believe, and I don't have proof of this, but I believe that the additional baseline studies that should be in here are the costs of make ready. So for multiple unit dwellings, apartment buildings, the costs as reported in the earlier study, the EV roadmap, I believe to be underestimates of the actual make-ready costs, meaning that the costs to apartment dwellers and low-income households are likely larger than previously reported. And for a low-income household, you need a 240-volt open circuit to put a charger in. That's going to require an upgrade of about $1,000 per house for that. I think we need a better understanding of the actual costs at the house level, especially for low-income houses and for multiple unit dwellings. And I think and that's because Maine is not average. Using national average data is, I don't believe, the correct way to do that, because our housing stock is older. Just like we have more lead paint than many places, we have an older housing stock, and we need to take into account that the make-ready costs are probably larger for that. The other is, and I'll say this as an idiosyncratic EV owner, the reliability of EV charging is essential, especially if you go to battery electric vehicles. And notwithstanding, I know Efficiency Maine has performance requirements when they subsidize public chargers, but there's one thing between a company saying that they have a certain degree of reliability and another is actually an audit of the reliability of the chargers. So I think we need an independent audit of charger reliability and enforcement mechanisms. And I'll stop with that and let Mark talk.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just want to quickly, you just gave a really good example of something that came up, after the original work of this group was done, and that will be reflected in the appendix of the report, and that was that your make ready, that piece. So that's a really good example of, sort of follow on things. In the interest of time, since that's sort of one of my charges, Matt, as I turn the floor over to you, thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to invite you to focus first on the 3 questions we've posed. Are the goals, actions, and metrics meaningful? Do they address barriers for priority populations? And will they ensure shared benefits for Maine's people and communities? And then we're going to take detailed feedback in writing, because we're going to be able to because I'll just say we've got a lot to get through. We want to give everybody a stretch break in a few minutes, but we've got a lot to get through. And so we're going to try to stick to our little format here, hopefully not at the expense of quality and critical feedback. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Carol. Appreciate it. I was going to start with that discussion points anyway, so that's perfect. I'll just walk through and agree largely with what Jonathan said. For starting with goal 1, just for perspective, one of the tasks that we had was trying to figure out, the barrier, I think, that we had around the actual vehicle prices. And I think the inclusion of having used vehicles in a program is really essential. So I just want to say that for background purposes. There is also a larger task here that at some point I think we have to take up. Is it meaningful and practical? We still have a substantial amount of EVs that cannot be sold directly into Maine. I've mentioned that before. I think that's a challenge in some places. I would add on top of that, for equity purposes, the servicing of those vehicles, certainly a concern. So I would say that's probably secondary there. Goal number 2. I think, as Jonathan had said, one of the cost factors related to EV charging ability among LMI and the housing, in particular multifamily, that task has already started, but finding that baseline sort of number makes a lot of sense. I agree with that. I think the agencies charged with ensuring that happens have started to look at where money should be best spent. I think that's good. Goal number 3 is probably the one where I find the discussion point to be one of the hardest to figure out. Logistically, both DHHS and the Department of Transportation are spending money today getting people to and from, particularly in rural areas. I think the ability for those agencies to start working together and talking about how they will share those resources will be better for all. I think DHHS is $65 million a year plus on getting people to medical appointments and such, and the DOT has a program as well. I think that task in itself for goal number 3 is probably where this committee will have to revisit at some point with the Climate Council to figure out, how do we meet those goals, and what is the methodology for trying to figure out where the most rural routes can be combined in a ride share. So I'll leave it with that because I'm really curious to hear what others have to say about these.
All right. Thank you, Matt, and thanks to both of you. And I'll open the floor for any additional feedback or clarifying questions. Hi, Nick.
Hello. I think I know the answer to this. I just want to make sure that public transportation includes ferries, particularly for geographically isolated communities like islands. It seems like it's encompassed in there, but it might be worth calling it out or explicitly naming it. Ferries are often left out of public transportation conversations by many fronts. So
thank you for asking for that specificity. Thank you. Helpful.
And it's in there. So I'm excited for you to see the reference to some of that work when you get the full chapter. So thank you for that.
Seeing no other feedback at this point, seems like an ideal time for our 10-minute break because it's 12:21-ish. Gabe, your face just lit up. Everybody needs to stretch. So thanks for hanging in here, folks. And we'll see you back here at 12:30 and we'll move on to other chapters. So thanks a bunch.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. If you're within hearing distance, we're going to get back underway. Thanks for your promptness. It's always fun to see how much you can cram in 10 minutes. It's sort of like a personal challenge. I don't know.
We'll invite Equity Subcommittee members, if you're back, to turn your videos back on. If you want to have them off because you are eating or have other distracting, really cute background participants like Ambassador Dana, we totally get it. Feel free, but you can jump back on and off as you feel comfortable.
Wow, Nick, you made it all the way to ABC. That's crazy.
And through the line and everything and back up.
No, it's like, I will just say, the gods of food must have been with you, because getting through that line, not always easy. All right.
Yeah.
Well, enjoy, and we'll all live vicariously. Jess, let's get going.
That sounds great. All right, so we're going to switch tactics here. And for the remainder of the chapters, I'm going to walk through the goals and metrics and share just a summary of the barriers we're seeking to overcome and the actions we've proposed. The summary is really based on the sum of our learning together as a subcommittee, and it's informed by all those consultations and conversations we've had throughout this process. We are not going to walk through the actions, the baseline studies, or the other details for this chapter. This is where it's important. We encourage you to really flip through the slides that you have in parallel, and we can talk through any specific thoughts you have during our discussion. We'll continue to turn to subcommittee representatives to kick off each discussion, and we'll start with chapter B and really make our way through the rest of them here. So with that, here are the goals for chapter B. And what we're trying to achieve through these goals is increased access to clean, to low cost, and to efficient energy and heating for individuals and households who have the highest energy burdens. We're also trying to bring additional weatherization and building code expertise to small, rural, or otherwise under-resourced communities. And across all of our recommendations, we're really trying to identify those people and communities who are in most need, and we're trying to serve them first, helping overcome financial, logistical, technical, or other barriers through our targeted recommendations. At the same time, however, we've talked about the fact that priority households and communities, particularly in this sector, can often be on a long waiting list for building efficiency work, or they may face other barriers to accessing timely and immediate home renovations. And so we need to ensure that while they wait and while we help remove barriers to programs, folks continue to have access to strong energy assistance benefits. With rising energy costs statewide, driven by global fossil fuel markets, an equitable transition to cleaner heating systems and healthier buildings requires both improving access to weatherization services and improving enrollment in assistance programs. Finally, we recommend that new and renovated construction, especially when serving a lower income market, is built to the highest efficiency standards. And so our recommended actions in this chapter look to increase information and data about homes most in need of efficiency retrofits, to continue to prioritize those people most vulnerable for access to state efficiency funding, and to identify and address additional barriers, whether they're financial, technical, or otherwise, for folks to upgrade their heating systems and weatherize their homes. We also recommend streamlined assistance to heating bill assistance, streamlined access to heating bill assistance, and figuring out and really addressing the gap between people who are eligible for heating bill assistance and people who actually enroll in heating bill assistance. And we look to support all of this work with more training and education in rural communities for code enforcement and more funding for clean energy projects and affordable housing. So with that, we're going to look together at the metrics for this chapter. And our equity outcome metrics break down the two existing Maine weight indicators of energy saved via ongoing efficiency measures and heat pump installations total. Our equity outcome metrics include both energy cost burden and weatherization or energy efficiency projects in low-income homes and among energy bill assistance recipients. We would expect that as the latter, those projects go up, the former, that energy burden will go down. The number of affordable housing units built or renovated to be efficient and heat pump installations in low-income homes are also equity outcome metrics that break down those two existing Maine vote weight indicators. Our monitoring metrics are meant to help us keep track of those outcomes, and they include comprehensive data about housing stock and systems across priority populations. They benchmark energy efficiency spending in low-income households. They seek to understand the gap, as I mentioned, between eligible and enrolled heating assistance recipients. And they think about the distribution of building code training opportunities around the state. And that is my very brief summary of quite a lot of content in this chapter. With that summary in mind, I am going to turn straight to our Equity Subcommittee representatives from the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group for discussion. But I'll, of course, invite you all to flip through the appropriate slides and let us know if you have clarifying questions about the content on those slides after we invite folks here to speak. Our Leslie and Gabriella both had the opportunity to send feedback in advance, leaving the in-person feedback to the very capable Anya. And so I'll just turn it over to her.
Thanks, Jess. I wish they were both here, but I'll do my best. In terms of looking at the questions of, are the goals and metrics meaningful, and do they address barriers for populations? I think between Gabriella, Leslie, and I, it seemed like there was a general yes to those questions looking at the draft. I personally have just a little bit of feedback on some of the specific language, which I can share now. For goal number 1, I'd love to just see a little bit more about including an analysis of who's currently using programs, and I guess the way that it's worded now, obviously assessing the barriers to the programs now is important, but wanting to see maybe more language on identifying if there's a need for additional programs, or looking how to shift programs that are working for some populations but aren't reaching target populations. And I guess to give an example of what that might look like we have some really great rebate programs with Efficiency Maine, but those programs in whatever form that they're in, because they require putting money up front, they might just not work for some populations based on just the essence of what they are as programs. So just looking for slight changes in language to include identifying possible other programs that are, other possible programs that would be important to look at. And then I guess maybe to add to the appendix at this point, given that I think these things are after our initial discussions, is I'd love to see an incorporation of recommendations from the Clean Energy Workforce Report that came out earlier this year. I'm not sure that quite fits into the buildings section. Maybe it's another section. But yeah, would love to see more language around expanding access to apprenticeship programs. And then I think I saw a comment in the chat earlier too about metrics, not just about the quantity of jobs, but also the quality of jobs. And then also just curious too, if in the appendix, it could be included something about the Joint Standing Committee on Housing, and just looking at incorporating whatever recommendations they come out with the recommendations of this group, just because there's so much overlap there with housing and climate change. And I think that's all I have for now. And again, thanks all, and wish Gabriella and Leslie were here to add more.
Anya, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for ably covering that. Yep.
And I will just say the workforce recommendations are absolutely already reflected, and I'm hopeful that the folks who read chapters C and D read through those as well. It's part of, we all got a little piece of the elephant here, but we will all get the whole thing for review after this meeting.
Thanks. Any other feedback at this point? Thanks, Nick, for weighing in on that. All right, Jess, in the interest of time, let's keep moving.
Okay, and I'll just again invite everyone. You have a lot of time after this to provide more feedback. We know we're doing kind of an abbreviated review of all of this, but you have the full slide deck, you'll have the full report. Please don't take our shortcut here as a lack of willingness to continue to engage on this body of work. We absolutely want to continue to refine it until its final version. So looking at chapter C then, which is our energy chapter. And hey, just reflecting that these chapters go together. You can't be talking about energy and energy workforce, which are actually in chapter D, without talking about these energy projects in chapter C, without talking about home energy efficiency retrofits in chapter B. So let's just be clear that we're trying to structure this aligned with Maine Won't Wait, and we recognize that this full body of work is really economy-wide and overlapping. But with that in mind, let's look together at the goals for chapter C. These goals are about both increased access to affordable clean energy projects and meaningful opportunities for priority populations and communities to participate in clean energy decision-making, recognizing that in many instances, the siting of large-scale renewable projects and associated transmission infrastructure can present opportunities and challenges for communities which host them. With regards to accessing clean energy benefits, we're particularly focused again on people with the highest energy burdens, on low-income folks and renters, and on communities without access to planning resources or capital to invest in clean energy projects. We're also focused on clean energy opportunities for natural resource industries in this chapter due to their potential exposure to climate risks. And for those who function on the economic margin, perhaps their lack of resources or low ability to tolerate risk in accessing clean energy solutions. Our recommended actions in this chapter seek to increase information and data about people and households facing the highest energy burdens, and to increase access to cheaper clean energy resources, including where appropriate community solar projects for those households. We also recommend providing financial and technical assistance to households, to businesses, and to communities to help them access the benefits of clean energy, including, if appropriate, exploring new or expanded financing options that consider potential lower borrowing capacity of low-income households or communities, or which solve other financial challenges. Beyond that individual level, we've also recommended formal mechanisms to consider and involve disadvantaged communities in energy siting decisions, and to assist host communities in accessing fair and equitable benefits from clean energy development. So with that brief summary, we're going to flip over and look at the metrics associated with this chapter. And there are two Maine Won't Wait indicators that align with the first goal in this chapter, both the progress towards 80% clean energy by 2030 and energy saved via ongoing efficiency measures. Our equity outcome metrics then ask about energy cost burden for priority populations and disadvantaged communities. This equity outcome metric really reflects that part of our goal in transitioning to clean and efficient energy and heating sources should be to reduce inequities for priority and vulnerable populations. We would hope again to see this indicator decline over time. As we talked about earlier, this metric is meant to capture the overall progress among priority populations. This is really critical because so many different sector-specific interventions impact this energy cost burden. And then when we add federal funding on top of that, we know that there's more than one agency, more than one program, more than one intervention helping reduce energy cost burden. So this metric really provides a way to capture the outcome of many programs. We also have some monitoring metrics associated with this chapter, including the number and percentage of low and moderate income households enrolled in community solar projects, assuming again that these projects provide less expensive energy and that the design of the projects and billing does not place undue burden on the customer. And reflecting that there's just a lot of federal dollars going to financing clean energy projects in disadvantaged communities. Those dollars will flow through a green bank or similar models. Another monitoring metric is really to look at those dollars and the percentage of them spent by the Clean Energy Accelerator and other state-sponsored clean energy and energy efficient financing mechanisms by priority populations. Finally, we also propose a monitoring metric that tracks the number of decisions that consider and involve disadvantaged communities who are impacted by or benefit from clean energy projects. So that is quite a lot of content, a number of really good metrics here, both building on existing and looking at things that help us monitor progress over time. And we want to open the floor to our Equity Subcommittee members who represented the Energy Working Group for discussion. Given what I know are some time constraints, I might invite Jason to kick us off, if that makes sense.
Sorry about that. My mute button had disappeared there for a moment. Thank you, Jessica. I apologize. I have a 1 o'clock meeting, so thank you for allowing me to go first. In review of this specific section of the report, I think that there has been a significant progress made in terms of some of the feedback that we provided through earlier meetings. I think that as I reflect on both the population level, the household level, and the community level, just a few things that I noted as I was reviewing the chapter on the household level. One of the critical concerns that I have is, although there are great metrics to measure the effectiveness and the reflection of there being multiple programs, I'm interested in both, first and foremost, the initial study that that this particular chapter calls for, the comprehensive assessment, if you will, of energy burden for low-income households, but also the ability to help navigate, which I think is well articulated in the report, that there would be a clean energy outreach and navigator program for households, businesses, and communities, because as someone who works regularly with a rural, a disadvantaged population in our region, oftentimes navigating those systems and those various programs is critical. I think that if there's an opportunity to look at something that we can do to sort of go further upstream with that, is how do we look at some of the connections between some of these programs, and beyond just helping individuals navigate, how we look at potential government solutions to be able to streamline some of these programs so that individuals don't have to do so many backflips and cartwheels to get through and access those programs. So as it relates to goal 1, that's some of my feedback in terms of the of my thoughts on that one. Jessica, did you want me to go on to goal 2, or did you want me to pass it on to my colleagues before I do that?
Let's just have you go on, Jason, and then we'll turn to Claudette and Fortunat as well.
I've previously articulated one of the challenges that I have with goal 2, and that's at the community level, to ensure that disadvantaged communities are able to access programs and specifically projects for their communities. I do remain concerned that without some kind of a more regional or regionalized approach, and again, draw the parallel to efforts to expand broadband in the state of Maine, where again, I think you've done or the report does a sufficient job of addressing training and technical assistance opportunities. I don't know that it realistically looks comprehensively at how do we ensure that there are opportunities for communities when political will might not be in play to do so.
Thanks very much, Jason. Maybe turning to Claudette and then Fortunat.
Sure. So, yeah, so overall, I think the goals are meaningful as well. I actually have a question though about the comprehensive assessment of energy burden in Maine. I'm not following sort of what's different. I mean, we know that we have 24%. I mean, there's a statistic in here about sort of what that energy burden looks like. So it's not clear to me what's different about this assessment versus what we already have. That's one observation I made. And then otherwise, on the actual monitoring metrics for goal number 1, in particular, it talks about dollars and spend by Clean Energy Accelerator and other state-sponsored clean energy and efficiency financing mechanisms, et cetera. So it's, you know, it's monitoring the dollars and percentage spent, and maybe that's sort of a good place to start. But you know, probably a clearer driver would be to set a target, and whether you're actually achieving that or not. Otherwise, from an equity outcome metrics, you know, energy cost burden is a good measurement, certainly for homeowners. And I'm assuming maybe it's energy cost burden, or there's some kind of measurement at the community level as well for similar type of balanced measure. And then for goal number 2, ensuring fair costs and benefits to disadvantaged people. Under the monitoring metrics, it's the number and percentage of state renewable energy grid reliability infrastructure or infrastructure decisions that consider and involve disadvantaged communities. I'm not sure how you're measuring or how you're monitoring the decisions are sort of involving that. I wonder if it's more about, again, sort of getting to the results of how many are actually concretely, what can we concretely measure about how many projects involve disadvantaged communities. And then, so also under the equity outcome metric, I wonder, is there a reason we couldn't measure, for example, the number of clean jobs added? I mean, can we quantify the benefits? The percentage of tax revenue reduction maybe in priority populations, or maybe even energy cost burden number in percent, or I'm sorry, dollars in percent here could work as well. I have to believe we've got to be able to come up with some way to measure that it shouldn't just be NA. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Claudette. Fortunate to build on that?
Yeah, sure. I'll be brief. I think I would answer in the affirmative to the 3 headline questions for both of these goals and metrics and actions. Just a couple of detailed comments on goal number 1 in particular. I think both the second bullet, the second action, increase LMI household enrollment in affordable community solar, and the associated metric, maybe a little narrower than it needs to be. Jason noted that there are lots of low and moderate income customers who are single family homeowners who may have opportunity to do on-site solar, not just community solar, under the right program structures. So that seems like it. There's maybe a little more limiting than it has to be. And then the other comment I had was on the third action, the sort of navigator program. This may already be included in here, but there are lots of available resources for communities to be, better at permitting and interconnecting solar. That are being resourced at the federal level, whether that's the Solar Smart designation or the solar app and things like that. And so if communities here is inclusive of municipalities, I think we should maybe draw that a little more explicitly, because I think this goes to some of the other recommendations about towns who have a little less bandwidth to do this stuff well. And it turns out there are resources out there that we can take advantage of, but even just finding them is actually kind of a challenge for towns. And I think on goal 2, my primary comment, I think, is maybe somewhat similar to what Claudette just said, which is I struggle a little bit with how we will measure, consider, and involve as a measurement. I suspect somebody smarter than me can come up with a way, but it just occurs to me that that's a challenging way to word a metric.
Thanks, Fortunat. Jess, any comments before I open the floor?
Really appreciate that feedback. The only thing that I'll say is that with our equity outcome metrics, and to Claudette's point, we really think of those as breakdowns of the existing minimum weight indicators. And so we had to narrow our scope because we could absolutely track everything. The other thing I'll note, and I think that this was relevant in our conversation about host community benefits, is that host communities should be able to identify the benefits within, obviously, the allowable universe of benefits through these projects on their own. And so some host communities may say, we really want local jobs. Some host communities may say, we want that tax benefit. Some host communities may say, we want lower energy costs at this percentage for every single subscriber to this program. So I'm also thinking about part of the idea here is to allow host communities to understand and know what they're able to ask for, and then to locally determine those benefits across programs. So just thinking about that when I think about your comments, but also keeping in mind to the guardrails we put in ourselves for equity outcome versus monitoring metrics for what it's worth structurally.
So Jess, interesting to that point, maybe the equity outcome really is it is sort of articulated or itemized by the host community, but at least there's something there, right? There's sort of an expectation that helps people understand that there's a way to realize that it, that's having some good impact.
Cool.
Any other feedback at this point from anyone? Hearing none. Jess?
All right, let's look together at Chapter D, folks. Thank you so much. Please stretch your body, drink some more water, have a snack. We're going to keep working our way through here. And we're going to start by looking at the goals for Chapter D. And I'll remind you that Chapter D is really one of those bridge chapters that it has two sets of recommendations related to economic development and jobs. This is Chapter D in Maine Won't Wait. We both focus in Maine Won't Wait on new job opportunities in the clean energy economy and within our goals, especially focusing on those opportunities for historically disadvantaged workers. And the second focuses in on those natural resource industries, including farming, fishing, and forestry, and helping those industries and workers adapt to a changing climate. Our subcommittee recommendations seek to address barriers to employment in both these natural resource industries and clean energy industries for priority individuals. And at the same time, they seek to ensure continued prosperity and resilience for those communities where local economies, livelihoods, and cultures depend on these industries. And our recommendations in this chapter really center around the idea of a just transition, or this idea that a fair and equitable climate and economic transition requires planning for industry's ability to respond to climate change in a way that does not negatively impact and even strengthens, where possible, workers and industries facing disproportionate climate impacts. Together, I think a just transition proposes that we make sure that those priority populations and communities continue to have access to high quality and climate friendly jobs, even in a changing climate. And there is just a ton of work already underway in this sector, whether it's the Clean Energy Partnership or the Clean Energy Workforce Report. And so our recommended actions in this chapter really focus in on additional specific opportunities to advance equity. For the clean energy sector, our recommendations address workforce bottlenecks for electricians. They help ensure that clean energy, career development, and job resources engage priority individuals and address educational, cultural, or other barriers to entry into these sectors. We also recommend proactive work from the state to understand and plan for career pathways for workers in industries which might be impacted by climate change in the future. On the natural resource industry side of the shop, we recommend increasing data about the makeup of this sector and its businesses, including continuing to identify barriers to entry and opportunities to increase diversity and access to natural resource industry careers for priority populations and communities. We also recommend the state support value-added product development in the sector, as well as targeted job training opportunities to help workers adapt to climate change. And finally, we recommend assessing the impact of climate risks on the food supply chain in Maine, particularly in communities which experience food insecurity or which rely on subsistence agriculture. We reflect that this recommendation could equally apply over in Chapter F around healthy and resilient communities. It just lived here because we were focused in on the natural resource sectors. So Chapter D has a lot. It has really those two key focuses, and I want to look together at metrics then. And this is where actually one of the things that Claudette mentioned comes up, because the Maine Won't Wait indicator that aligns most closely with our clean energy recommendations is the number of clean energy jobs created. And so our equity outcome metrics look at the number of those jobs held by priority populations and the geographic distribution of those jobs. There isn't an existing Maine Won't Wait indicator associated with natural resource industry jobs or workers, or with climate resilience in those industries, even though many of the strategies in Maine Won't Wait are designed to increase the resilience, both of lands and waters and of workers in these sectors. However, just sticking within those guardrails, since there isn't a clear statewide indicator, and since we need more and comprehensive data about this sector, we don't propose an overall equity outcome indicator for that specific goal at this time. However, we do propose intermediate indicators on both of these goals. So to monitor progress on the clean energy goal, we propose the number of clean energy job trainees or apprentices from priority populations, recognizing the need to create inclusive career pathways into these fields, And we talk about the geographic distribution of spending on clean energy workforce programs as a way toward monitor progress towards our equity outcome metric. For our natural resource goal, monitoring metrics include components of diversification, adaptation, and job preservation. You can read through them here or on your slide deck, kind of in parallel. And as we turn to the Equity Subcommittee for discussion, this chapter we reflect includes work related to the Energy Working Group, related to the Natural and Working Lands Working Group, and related to the Coastal and Marine Working Group. So we shared it with all of those subcommittee representatives, and we'll try to take kind of a tour around the room and hear from as many of you as time allows. With that, we should turn to the discussion. And I'll invite really anyone who wants to chime in. Maybe what we could do is take feedback on the clean energy related recommendations here first, and then turn to the natural resource sector recommendations kind of across the team here. If that sounds good, would any of our equity subcommittee reps like to comment on the clean energy jobs recommendations?
I'm happy to just, I think, as you know, there's a lot going on here already. So this is, I think, the part of good news here. I think the goal number one is a good one. I don't know if it's deliberate or an oversight. In the slides, one of the recommended next actions from the chapter did not make it. And that was explore opportunities to grow the number of licensed electricians. I think, you know, most of us
oversight, Fortunate, thank you.
You know, the clean energy transition goes through electricians, right? And that is an absolutely critical part of the workforce, sort of subset of the clean energy workforce that I think we need to keep focused on. And to that point, I wondered whether a sort of more specific monitoring metric around that, the licensed workforce is appropriate, not just the size of the workforce overall. It goes a little bit to Representative Cuddy's question about quality of jobs as opposed to quantity of jobs in the chat earlier. And then finally, I just had a question about how you measure geographic distribution of jobs, whether that is by location of the job site, location of the employer, or location of the employee, and which one is the most meaningful. I think probably the last of those is the one we should elect if we have the option to do it.
Fortunate, that's awesome. And it gives us the opportunity just to say another thing about just structural guardrails. In many instances, this subcommittee recommended, I think, a lot of actions that are about dismantling a specific barrier, but did not in many instances say, and this is how you do it. This is the exact implementation step, recognizing that in many instances it's the program head or the agency who will look at that and say, great, I understand how to change the rules to make this work. We took in many instances a similar approach with metrics. We said, these are the outcomes we're seeking to achieve. Here are the metrics that we're seeking to track, and left the definition of that specific metric up to the agency who's involved in the program that would actually be able to assess that. And that is just for flexibility in implementation, but also to leave the actual implementation pathway up to the responsible entity. I think in this instance, we should footnote and say these are different ways to track clean energy jobs, but our general inclination, unless we collectively have made very specific recommendations, and in some instances we did, right? This subcommittee suggested a specific intervention in allowing the transfer of heating assistance program benefits with heat pump installations, very specific. Unless we had a reason to, as a subcommittee, we left the flexibility open for implementers, just for what it's worth.
Thanks. Jonathan, you had your hand up and then you put it down. So I'll just do a check.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted I think with the Fortunate mentioned this point, but I want to reinforce it, which is it's just not the number and percentage of clean jobs. It's the quality of those jobs. It's the wages. We should be tracking. We don't want low income identified individuals stuck in low income jobs, right? We want to make sure that those are better jobs. So I think we need to track the quality and wages. So that should be fairly straightforward.
Thank you. Anything else? Oh,
no, I was just going to say anything else on clean energy. If not, I'd like to invite the folks who looked at the natural resource sector job to talk about that as well. Super. Gabe or Nick, did you have anything on the natural resource side of the shop?
Sure.
I'm going to defer to you, Nick, and then I'll jump in.
So before I start, I just want to name a really big concern that I have for the future of our coastal communities in this state, that they're facing a climate-driven existential crisis in the form of a shifting regulatory regime that's responding to how right whales are changing their feeding and behavioral patterns. There's a really, really strong climate signal in this, and the impacts will be felt of these changes will be felt most significantly in our smallest, most rural, and more easternmost communities along our state. There are some communities out there that have 10, 15, 20, even 25% of their populations have lobster licenses in the fishery. And so a impact on the fishery will have a very significant impact on these communities. It's an existential crisis for many of these communities, and that colors a little bit of what I'm going to say. Would also note that I appreciate how some of the abrupt impacts of climate change are accounted for in some of the community resilience side of things. On the natural resources side, we're also facing a variety of abrupt climate change impacts. And I think that's an opportunity to dig in a little bit more in the future. And would also very much support methodologies that allow the subcommittee and the Climate Council to look at cumulative impacts and shift between sectors. I think both of those pieces are really important for this work moving forward. So with that on the goals, Chapter D, I think the local economies, livelihoods, and culture depend on these industries. That's a huge consideration that's worth lifting up. Priority populations, literacy and educational attainment. It's something that many in the seafood sector that we work with, some of them struggle to read. We work with people whose wives print out their emails to them, and the wives sit the chair in the evening and read the emails to their husband. I think there's an element of making sure in these transitions we're paying attention to literacy, educational attainment, and making sure that our programs are working for that population too. Might add frontline communities to the priority populations for this. In terms of goal 2 actions, I would suggest that at least for some industries, the barriers to exit are equally as important to consider as barriers to entry. We want, I think, at least in some of our fisheries, we're trying to move people out. We've been systematically trying to reduce the number of people in the lobster fishery for the last 25 years. There are certainly challenges to entry to that fishery, but there are also places where we want to be thinking about, can we get people out of some of these industries? There's an action around developing a pilot program to support clean tech and clean fuels transition in natural resource industries. It fits really well with one of the actions in the last set of conversations too. It's worth noting with the Coastal and Marine Working Group hat on that we had a bunch of conversations in the fisheries and aquaculture sector around how mitigation work and the transition to clean energy is a really important adaptation strategy. The value of doing that work in the seafood sector isn't the mitigations, the CO2 mitigations that result, it's the ability for people to stabilize their long-term operating business costs. They're facing a variety of other unpredictable swings in their business. Having stable energy costs is huge. As a Coastal Marine Working Group, that's a place we weren't able to fully articulate our thinking and get it into the report. And so it's great to start seeing some of those threads in here. And then I think the marine sector has done a ton of work on workforce development needs and characterizations within the workforce. Maine is undertaking that work right now. I think a lot of what will be needed on the seafood side is being covered in other areas. And so happy to make linkages to those other groups, other bodies, so they can be referenced. Probably their footnotes or references in the appendix. And then the last just thing to say on this is fisheries have done a lot of work on understanding access. And from a fisheries management perspective, controlling entry or exit from a fishery is a really important management tool of the fish populations. And so there's a very strong scientific connection between how many people you let fish in a fishery and the health of the fisheries populations. And so for fisheries management, entry and exit is one of the management tools for the fishery source, not for the socioeconomic value on the community side. So just worth saying that at this point, it's slightly different than some other natural resource industries.
Thanks, Gabe.
Yeah, just a quick tag on, so to Nick's, referencing the barriers to exiting, just wondering in, the monitoring metrics, I mean, we have the MWBE percentages and numbers in natural resources and industry, thinking about like what percentage of priority populations are diversifying, they're currently in natural resource industry, diversifying like out of or diversifying within to a sector that's not being threatened by climate change. So just going along with that, like, is there opportunity in the future for an additional monitoring metric? And then thinking too about the geographic distributions of training programs and initiative for natural resource workers. So like, that's capturing where people can access the programs, but when just thinking about rural communities and broadband and economic diversification, would an additional metric make sense of actually access, like number of or number and percentage of priority population members accessing those programs, because maybe it's not something they're doing in person, but they're still accessing it, and they're still diversifying within either the natural resource sector or out of it.
Thanks so much. And Fortunat, I'm noting your comment in the chat. Thank you. Anyone else have any feedback they want to provide at this point? Thank you. Thank you all so much, Jess.
All right, let's keep going. We're on track here. And this next section is definitely related to the latter half of the conversation that we just had. So looking together at the goals for Chapter E. These goals seek to increase access to natural areas, to protect the livelihoods of those who work in Maine's natural and working lands and waters, and to enable further consultation with tribal nations around management of lands, waters, and data. They also try to make good climate information available in appropriate ways to people working in these industries, especially when they need to make decisions about a climate uncertain future. In this chapter, we also focus on the importance of culture and our understanding of nature and the environment, both in terms of understanding who uses and who feels welcome to use green spaces in Maine, and in terms of understanding the value of traditional ecological knowledge in addressing our changing climate. So there's a lot in this chapter. A recent study in New England found that communities with the largest proportions of low-income residents or people of color experience significantly less access to protected open spaces. And one of our recommendations in this chapter is to really understand that trend in Maine. We need good baseline data on the distribution of and access to and use of green spaces, natural working lands, and waters across the state, especially for disadvantaged communities. We also recommend the establishment of equity criteria for natural resource related grant making, as well as associated technical assistance to help priority communities apply for and receive funding. We've had several recommendations in this chapter regarding data as well. For example, we recommend adding social science to the state's scientific climate assessments, making climate data available in a single platform that communities can actually access and use to make decisions. We recommend consulting with tribal communities around the use of data that impacts or is generated by their communities. And finally, we recommend including more Maine people in participatory climate science processes. We think those participatory processes, kind of citizen science, can help build trust, climate literacy, and support for community-driven climate action. So as we look at our metrics together for this chapter, we have a Maine won't wait indicator associated with the first goal, or a couple of them actually, which are both the overall percentage of land conserved and this idea of climate investment funding leveraged. The equity outcome metrics for the first goal break down these statewide indicators and monitor the geographic distribution of publicly accessible lands and waters, as well as of natural resource related grant funding. As intermediate indicators to monitor progress, we know that access is not just about distribution, but it's also about dismantling other barriers such as income or distance from some sort of recreational or other natural or working land, transportation, accessibility, and sometimes even cultural barriers such as feelings of welcome at state parks or other publicly accessible spaces. The intermediate indicators here seek to give managers of those spaces access to better information about who uses them and critically to shed more light on who doesn't. You can read through them here or on your slide deck to understand in greater detail what we're proposing. So turning to our second goal, which really focuses in on data, there isn't an existing Maine Moat indicator associated with data, with research, or with decision-making in that space. However, our monitoring metrics that we propose here include keeping track of tribal consultation efforts, as well as of instances of use of traditional ecological knowledge, which is often held by tribal nations, but is also often held by natural resource dependent communities or practitioners, kind of keeping track of both of those used in state climate planning processes. These metrics really speak to an effort to increase ways of understanding environmental change and to legitimize and value local realms of knowledge. Our final monitoring metric seeks to make climate data more accessible and useful, again, through keeping track of community participation in data collection processes. So as I turn us open to discussion, this chapter again includes work related to the Natural and Working Lands Working Group, to the Coastal and Marine Working Group, but also to the Science and Technical Subcommittee. And so we shared it with all of the representatives supporting those groups. We should have time to hear from many of you. And with that, I just want to flag initially, Adelaide's here, but she's double booked a little bit, so was able to share her feedback with me in advance. I just want to let you know that we've taken that feedback. We'll continue to take it virtually asynchronously with this meeting. So I'll turn it to Gabe, to Nick, maybe first, again, reflecting the way this chapter is structured, and then to Jonathan to provide any feedback from the STS's perspective.
Thanks, Jess. So I would just say, in general, overall, I do feel that goals, actions, and metrics are meaningful. They do address barriers for priority populations and ensure shared benefits. Though one thing, again, future consideration for goal, for goal 1. Sorry, I just got like all of a sudden got confused. Are we like what strategy are we on here? But we're on E, correct?
Yes, no, and again, fully reflecting, seeing this body of work as a whole body of work is going to be really helpful. A lot of this is overlapping.
Okay, very good. So just thinking about actions under goal 1 for strategy or chapter E, strategy E, expanding access to natural resource grants for priority communities, just thinking like we don't really have a monitoring metric for that, and recognizing that really goes to the procedural equity side of things. But I'm just wondering of like the ease of tracking that among departments. And I think that would be really beneficial to understand, is there uniformity? Because I know that's a recommendation, in strategy F, to establish climate vulnerability and equity criteria for resilience funding, but just like seeing how that's important here too, if we're trying to expand access to natural resource grants for those priority communities, really understanding how the agencies and the departments are reducing those barriers, and is it uniform, and what does that look like? So just sort of tracking what those grants are and how they reduce barriers. And I know that's probably not exactly what you would be tracking, but I would say I think that's a key monitoring metric that I don't see that would be useful.
Thanks, Gabe.
Jump in with a couple of comments. Just on goal 1, noting that some working lands aren't appropriate for public access. So that's just want to make sure that that's captured, working waterfronts in particular. Goal 2, to lift up the action around adding a social scientist to the Science and Technical Subcommittee. My colleague Susie Arnold co-chairs that committee. She's a marine scientist by training, and has said multiple times she would very much appreciate having social scientists on the STS and supporting the work that they're doing. The second action around providing data, I would say working with businesses is also important, particularly for ocean stuff. Most of the decisions that impact our oceans are either state regulatory or federal regulatory decisions, or decisions that are made by individual businesses. And so I'd say communities and businesses here. And this again was a big conversation at the Coastal and Marine Working Group about how do you get the data and the information to the businesses who need to make decisions about their operations or their future investments as a business. How do you get them data that is at the right time scales, the right spatial scales, and helpful in terms of how far forward it's looking for the business decisions that they're making. And so I know there's a ton of work going into that in other places, but just would say adding business is important. And then love the participatory approach for gathering climate data. I think that's really important to make sure that we're hearing from the voices of the people who are on the water. Those are the people I tend to work with, as much as the people who are looking at the buoy data or other data information.
Thanks, Nick. I will note that there's a recommendation in chapter either F or G about providing climate information to both real estate professionals and lenders, which is seeking to at least increase the literacy of folks who are helping businesses make those investment decisions in providing information. So that is a recommendation that maybe you didn't get to see.
That is great. And I think at least for the marine sector, a lot of the investment decisions are not happening through banks. They're just happening through cash. But yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Any other feedback?
Jonathan, did you have anything further on the data recommendations?
Well, just in terms of the metrics, I mean, I mentioned this privately to Jessica, but this emphasizes the publicly accessible working lands. And I'm going to guess that there's a lot of private lands that are accessible, but not able to be tracked. And I don't know what to do about that. But I will send that perhaps we shouldn't only focus on public lands, even though I know it's relatively easier. But even within that, I do think maybe you have an idea. It's worth this discussion, which is how we go about measuring priority populations in communities, say at a land for Maine future site. I mean, you have logs. I mean, how are we going to track some of this stuff cost effectively? I don't know. That's a separate conversation. I don't want to derail us here, but I do think, we really do need to talk about how we can do some of this stuff cost effectively.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, just to clarify, the recommendation here is about publicly accessible lands. It does not clarify who those lands are held by. So it includes both privately held lands that we have data about and publicly held lands. It would include both.
All right. In the interest of time, anyone else want in at this point? All right, Jess, I think we're on F.
All right, 2 more friends, and you are all strong and brave, and I hope you have like little drips of caffeine as we continue to work through chapter F, which has a number of goals in it. This is a really robust chapter. So our first goal here helps increase assistance to disadvantaged communities to plan for climate change and to fund projects that increase community resilience. This includes really a deep focus in on the Community Resilience Partnership and asks it to continue to target its funds to those communities in most need and to continue to work with partners to recruit smaller and more socially vulnerable communities. Our goal here is to achieve proportional or better representation of those communities in the program over time. And I'll just note that this is one of those opportunities to really build on existing work that's happening already through that program. Our first goal also includes establishing equity criteria across all climate resilience funding opportunities and tracking that funding over time to ensure that vulnerable communities are not missing out. So in many ways, it parallels some of the conversations we had about natural resource related grants in our previous chapter. The second goal here focuses in on the intersections of climate change and health, especially for vulnerable people and communities. And we address several concerns under this goal, including both indoor and outdoor air quality, extreme heat, and based on your feedback, extreme cold, and psychological resilience to climate change. Our recommendations seek to provide more information about indoor air quality and its relationship to fossil fuel combustion inside of homes, as well as to assess outdoor air quality exposures and health outcomes in low income and rural communities identified as high risk through current air monitoring efforts. We also identify additional opportunities for the state to support municipalities, maybe who are looking to decrease exposure to transportation emissions through a specific action like the adoption of idling rules. Other recommendations in this chapter integrate climate considerations into existing planning efforts in health networks and at hospitals around the state. And finally, we recommend in this section the development of psychological resilience resources about climate change and the sharing of those resources with the number of folks who may engage with populations facing psychological challenges or anxiety around climate. This could include sharing resources with community members, with businesses, with healthcare systems, with schools, with other entities. Our third goal in this chapter really looks at that direct impact of natural hazard-driven events on vulnerable people and tries to make sure that people can respond safely to storms and other natural hazards driven by climate change, no matter their language, their information sources, mobility challenges, or other vulnerabilities. It focuses in on that immediate ability to respond to natural disasters. So with that in mind, let's flip and look together at the metrics. And we have a main weight indicator most closely related to at least the first couple of these goals, which is the number of towns or regions with resilient community plans or community resilience plans. Our equity outcome metrics look to break down that statewide indicator and ask about priority communities who have community resilience plans. As we turn to monitoring metrics, we're really looking to keep track of program level information about where funds are going, to keep track of information about improved public health monitoring, education, and prevention efforts associated at the intersection of health and climate. And we really look to understand the reach of natural hazard emergency alerts, including information or communication channels that folks access, languages that alerts need to be provided in, and whether or not the actions proposed by alerts are designed for and reach vulnerable populations in time and with a reasonable mechanism for action. There's a lot in there and a lot kind of in these monitoring metrics to look at kind of in parallel as we open up the conversation to the Equity Subcommittee for feedback. We again have invited representatives to two different working groups, the Community Resilience, Public Health and Emergency Management Working Group and Coastal and Marine again to share their thoughts on this chapter. With that, I might invite Becca to get us started, if that makes sense.
Sure. I'm sorry I had to leave. I had another meeting, so I missed much of everything else that you've talked about. So I'm very sorry about that. I feel very intimately knowledgeable about these recommendations because I'm also the co-chair of that same working group. So I'm like immersed in this, and I really would love feedback on it because I feel like it's just been like it's been so much time on this. So very excited to be talking about this with all of you. My high level is that I think we have really strong goals, actions, and metrics here. I'm really happy to see some uplifting of the air quality monitoring, the hospital engagement, and the community health needs assessment opportunities, as well as the psychological resilience opportunities. Those were recommendations that came out of the public health subgroup that didn't, quite get as much bolstering as we would have liked. So at first, so I'm really happy to see those in here because I do think they are very important for equity considerations. I think that just Jessica, to build off of some feedback that I think we've already received, and I don't know if you've talked about some of this already, so I do apologize if this is redundant. But when we talk about extreme heat, maybe reframing that to extreme weather so that we're also including cold in there and like vice versa. And then as well, I remember when we were initially working on our recommendations in public health, we use the term surveillance. It's a common term that in our lingo we use, but there were a lot of hackles raised when we used that term because people associated it with like government, national security type of wording. And I didn't know if that has come up around the word monitoring and if we should use a different word for that. If we should not use the word tracking, but use the word monitoring. I didn't know if that was something that had come up in other people's conversations or other folks on here, what your thoughts were around that. So I just wondered about that. I have a few other things for F, but I'm going to stop there because I am really curious to hear from, actually I have like 4 other things, but I'd like to hear from Nick and Gabe from their perspectives, as well as the group members. And then I can always just send you my like comments, Jessica, in the document. I'm also mindful of time, so I'm just going to stop there. But overall, very excited about this.
Thanks, Becca. Feedback from the team about language I'm hearing and other things. Yeah. Nick?
I was just going to dive into the rest of it, not the language.
Okay. Yeah.
I think the goals, particularly one, great, love it. Great to see this work moving forward, and very much appreciate how GOPIF has really moved the community resilience partnership work forward over the last year and a bit. I think that's a great example of early on in the community resilience working group or sub-working group of this broader working group, there are a bunch of conversations about how do you support capacity constrained communities and the real need to do that. And that was a very clear theme that came out from the working group. And this feels like it's heard here in the equity side, and that GOPIF is living into hearing that. So that's awesome. I think for the appendix or other notes, the Maine Connectivity Authority's regional broadband partners is another robust example of how to do this kind of work across a region. And then I think the last thing I would just say, and this is maybe a broader comment for the whole set of work, if I were a fisherman, if I were in a fishing family and I were reading this report, I would not see myself reflected in it. I would not see my concerns reflected in it. I would not see that I was part of this. I would feel more excluded and more on the outside than I would feel included by this work. And some of that goes to how things are named, and then some of that goes to the level of detail that is included for a variety of areas, but not on the natural resource side. So there's a bunch of places where fishermen are included in terms of rural geographies, natural resource dependence, yes, but the level of detail associated with those actions is challenging compared to the level of detail associated with some of the other things here. And I don't know what we do about that at this point, other than it might be helpful to name as an opportunity and priority for the next round of this work to say, we know we've got something here we've got to dig into. And there's a lot of challenges with digging into that. There's a lot of complexity. We'll have to talk about offshore wind when we do that. That's tough for the state, but like we can't ignore it. So we'll have to talk about whales. Great. Like, yeah.
Thanks, Nick.
Gabe, do you want in?
I don't have anything to add. I would just say I felt that, yeah, they met our goals. So yes, meaningful, address barriers and ensure shared benefits.
Thank you. Others? All right, Becca, I don't know how long your 4 are. We have a couple of minutes.
I don't think they're too long.
All right, well, why
I don't think they're too bad.
Yeah, let's get them on the record.
Okay.
In the recording, and then we've got a couple more minutes we can spend on this category. Yeah.
All right. And I'm going to apologize if some of this you've already talked about in other sections. I wonder if we should have a little bit more in here, and maybe we intentionally did not do this, but there's a lot, which is really good, about support for applying for funding. We name that in several places. I think that is very important. But I also think it's important that we, if we're going to be able to do this, provide support for implementing that funding. So it's not just getting it, but then once they get it, we need to help municipalities or whomever it is that's applied for it actually do some of the work. So if that feels like something that we could commit to, then I would like to name that in a few places in here. I also think we do a good job of describing as best we can different considerations for a frontline community, where I think we could consider adding more, given the air quality sections, is around proximity to emitters. South Portland is mentioned in here. I live here with my other hat on, I'm on the Board of Health here. With my other hat on, I'm on the Clean Air Advisory Committee. You got all these different public health hats. And I know that the neighborhoods that are proximate to the tank farms here have concerns about air quality. And I'm just naming that I wonder if, because we do focus on air quality, another frontline community would be neighborhoods that are proximate to tank farms, but also to hospitals. They're an emitter, to universities, they're emitters. So I just want to name, or I just want to suggest that maybe in that context, we also think about those neighborhoods. In a really good way, I think we talk about data and data equity and different types of data that can be used to help us identify populations that we really should be focusing on. I wonder if as an appendix, we could provide some resources, and I can share these if they're not already in our mix of information, but on responsible data sharing practices, because I think sometimes what can happen is we collect data and we share data with a really altruistic, very good reason for doing so, but there can be unintended negative consequences. And so I think just having some guidance and things for people to be thinking about as they're doing that would be really important. I also wonder, all right, moving on from 4, I just have 2 more. So I also wonder, and I don't think we can't fix this, and I don't know that we should. So I'm torn about whether we should name this. But I wonder about internal barriers to some of this work. So like staffing within state departments, like with some of that technical assistance, or with expanding the air monitoring. DEP needs staff, just one example of one department in this work. But do we need to name that there are barriers within the state's ability to respond and to do this work outside of other considerations? And then also regulatory considerations. So like right now with the permitting processes for emitters, the human health impacts are not considered, proximity to neighborhoods not considered. So I just didn't know if we should also talk about some of those other barriers to this work, but that may feel too far outside of our scope. I just wanted to raise those as questions. And that really is my last of my feedback on this.
Becca, a fair amount of stuff there for the appendix for sure. I think maybe outside of the scope a little bit of this group. I will say that all of my conversations with state agencies have focused on resources that they need to do this work.
Great.
And our collective conversation across the climate action plan is we commit to these actions and we will find ways over time to collectively partner to support this work at state agencies and with our partners. We're already working with so many of you with your other hats on in so much of the climate action plan implementation that I imagine this body of work as being able to inspire similar kind of resource related conversations, similar kind of partnerships and commitments to this work.
Great. Thank you. I am done now with mine for F. We haven't gotten a G yet, but I'm good on that.
Thanks for giving it so much thought. Jess, you want to take us through the final stretch of this portion of our session?
You bet. And there is only one goal for Chapter G, so that should help streamline this last section that we'll walk through together. It does, though, as a goal might contain a lot of recommended actions underneath it. So this is one of those instances where climate resilience and climate vulnerable infrastructure were considered in 2 different parts of the climate action plan, even though many of the recommendations align, even though the line between resilience and infrastructure is blurry. So I'm just noting we were tracking the framework of Maine won't wait as we structured these recommendations. So similar to the last chapter, we really wanted to make sure that frontline or disadvantaged communities have access to climate resilient infrastructure planning, technical assistance, and funding, similar in the way that we suggested that they should have access to climate resilience planning and funding. The state has the opportunity to help communities identify vulnerable infrastructure, support them in acquiring funding for planning and engineering, and help community members better understand climate risks and hazards. And we know, and I think this is really, thank you for reflecting this in your comments, but we know that support across the whole project pipeline is necessary, from identifying infrastructure at the first place to providing planning assistance to ensuring access to long-term and reliable funding to completing projects. So establishing equity criteria that takes into account a community's resources and its climate vulnerability across all infrastructure funding opportunities is one way to ensure that ongoing access to these opportunities has the ability to reach all communities. Finally, we know that homeowners and other people who own or acquire property or infrastructure might also want to understand potential climate risks to that infrastructure now and into the future. So a recommendation here is to promote climate risk literacy and resources for real estate professionals and other lenders. We talked about that just a little bit earlier as well. And so as we turn to look together at the metrics, this is a pretty streamlined chart. Maine Weight has two existing indicators for infrastructure investment. It has both climate infrastructure and investment funding and funding leveraged, as well as federal and private dollars leveraged per state dollar. We want to note that that last indicator existing in Maine Weight is broader than climate infrastructure funds. It can include energy or other climate-related federal or state funds. And there are just so many programs wrapped up in this indicator. It will absolutely take some time for agencies to organize their data to report statewide climate infrastructure funding for Maine Weight. It's also possible that this intersects with things like Justice 40 reporting at the federal level, which is the requirement that 40% of benefits of investments in climate and clean energy programs go to disadvantaged communities. So a lot here in really tracking funding opportunities for our priority communities. Therefore, building on all that work, our equity outcome metric, of course, breaks down that funding to disadvantaged frontline or other priority communities. It says not just total, but total funding to those communities whom we've identified as most vulnerable. You could also look at this metric per capita, which could account for smaller towns a little bit differently. Again, this is where the details we leave up to the party who will have to keep an eye on this. Our monitoring metric is the number and percentage of applications for these funds from disadvantaged or frontline communities, which is actually pretty important as a measure of accessibility and whether the outreach and technical assistance that we recommend is actually working to help reach and help communities assess risks, make plans, and apply for funding. So we have the full pipeline here, I think in a way that is meant to be reflected in Chapter F as well, and we can look to clarify those two chapters together. With that, I'll turn it over for just a few minutes of conversation with our Equity Subcommittee members, and I think relying initially on Becca for this as well.
So this one, a lot of the feedback, well, I thought this one looked really good too. I had fewer pieces of feedback on this because most of them were mirrored in F. The one thing that I was wondering about, and again, I'm sorry if you already talked about this, but I did see a comment earlier, and I had the same question around Justice 40 and the Infrastructure Implementation Committee, and I wasn't sure what that interaction was with this group, and if that's something that we want to comment on in here, or is that too far outside of the scope for this? But other than that, I didn't have any other questions or comments. I thought that we had strong goals, actions, and metrics. I thought that they addressed barriers. One idea could be a template for municipalities' websites around climate information and resources that we could share with municipalities so they could just kind of cut and paste that onto their website. And that might help with some accessibility of information for folks that go to their town's website. So those are my kind of high level thoughts on this, but I thought G looked good. And I don't know if anyone else has other feedback on this.
Jonathan?
Thank you. I'm reading the language. I'm sorry, I'm a plain language person. It says number and percentage of applications of climate infrastructure funding. Do we really mean that we are going to call this good if we get a lot of applications, or do we mean we want a lot of funding? I mean, I think the simple way it's written is it's applications, not funding. And I wonder if we'd be happy if we want to strengthen that to actually list funding, not just applications. And then the second thing is, I wonder, because a lot of this is in the way it's implemented, and I don't know that, I'm going to throw this out and I don't have an opinion, I'm throwing this out as an alternative, which is you could change if there's a benefit cost, say, calculation done into deciding prioritization of funds, because usually funds have to be prioritized, whether or not we want to give guidance on on how an agency prioritizing funds might go ahead and make this prioritization.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm just going to note that the monitoring metric is the number and percentage of applications, and the outcome metric is the amount of funding. So we do track the amount of funding, and we use as a way to track whether or not we're getting closer there as to whether or not applications are actually coming in the door. So I think we do both in this chapter. Regarding the latter, again, we, for the most part, have erred on the side of deferring to the implementing agencies to figure out how they're going to implement our recommendations. Our recommendations do say establish equity criteria that take into account both resources of the community and climate vulnerability. I think it would be outside of the scope of this group, maybe not outside of the scope of some individuals on this group, to talk about detailed cost-benefit analysis mechanisms to do that. But we have tended to defer to the implementation to agencies on that.
Thank you. Any other comments at this point?
I would just do a +1 for the end-to-end funding support. And we've seen it in the broadband sector, where the state is able to aggregate small projects that might not ever have had the capacity to move forward. And then the state is able to provide support through the implementation of those projects. It's working really well. Would love to see us do more of that collectively.
Thanks, Nick. Gabe, thanks for dropping your comment in the chat. I'm not going to read it, but we will capture it for sure. Thank you. And in the interest of time, I'm going to say, Jess, you want to take us to talking about next steps and sort of the future nature of equity in the climate realm for us?
Absolutely, Carol. Happy to do it. But I just want to say a huge thank you to the members of the Equity Subcommittee who stuck with us through all of that content. We know it's a lot to go through together. It is an opportunity to revisit the work that we've been building on for the past 2 years and to bring back together all of the shared learning from each of you who've been participating in the working group conversations. So thank you. Thank you for your continued support, for your continued participation, and for really listening to each other, speaking on behalf of the Equity Subcommittee's perspective on this body of work in each of the sectors that you've had the opportunity to dig into. We, again, just invite you to review the detailed recommendations and submit any other thoughts over the next few weeks by email. We'll talk a bit at the very end, my last slide here, about what the rest of the subcommittee's review process looks like in a few minutes. But before we did that, we just wanted to set ourselves up for a conversation at our next meeting and preview just a little bit more content, which includes proposals for an updated role and structure of the Equity Subcommittee and for additional procedural equity guidelines for the Climate Council. We'll discuss these proposals further at our next and final meeting. So this is really just a presentation so that we have them on the table for any clarifying questions. We've had the opportunity to speak about both of these with Ambassador Dana and with Gabriella, the co-chairs of this committee, and to adjust the proposals based on their feedback. And Ambassador Dana was actually initially on deck here to present these proposals to you. Given that she had to step out, I'll do that on her behalf, but these are really developed in consultation with both of the co-chairs of the committee. So, you know, we're seeking in this first proposal to facilitate the continued integration of equity into the state's climate work. And I think it's important to acknowledge just how this committee was created as we think about that. Returning back to really my first or second slide, in the Maine Climate Council's climate planning process, the council and its working groups did consider equity as they developed their recommendations. We know that Maine Won't Wait includes a lot of specific recommendations about investment in vulnerable communities. But Maine Won't Wait also had the opportunity to establish this subcommittee to continue that work, to really center the conversation about equity, to bring forward opportunities to advance equity and implementation of our climate plan. And our work together as an equity subcommittee over the past 2 years has really been grounded in the strategies contained in Maine Won't Wait. In many ways, our work was developed in response to the existing climate action plan, and our recommendations are meant to be incorporated into a body of work that is already well underway. And so moving forward, we're proposing a more integrated structure for this work, a structure that both recognizes our unique role as a subcommittee, especially in advancing opportunities for meaningful involvement, and also acknowledges the critical role of sector-specific expertise within each of the Climate Council's working groups. For that reason, we're proposing that the next equity subcommittee be made up of at least 2 sector-specific equity experts appointed to each working group to serve as full members of each working group, and additionally as members of the equity subcommittee, at least 2 social scientists appointed to the science and technical subcommittee, which we've talked about a few times, also to serve as members of the equity subcommittee, and the appointment of roughly a 5-member body of equity subcommittee advisors who would advise the Climate Council on equitable and meaningful involvement of priority populations in the state's climate planning process. This kind of advisory body should include members of the Climate Council, and equity subcommittee chairs would be selected from that group. The equity subcommittee in whole then would be comprised of, at minimum, the 19 members proposed above, and would convene twice annually, roughly speaking, to discuss progress across working groups and across the state's climate action plan. Equity subcommittee members would be participating at the same time in parallel with their working groups, and advisors would meet more frequently with council and working group leadership to advise on procedural equity. I think this structure actually reflects how we've been functioning over the past year, how we've split ourselves up to really support these sector-specific conversations to bring equity into the work of the climate action planning process. And it provides an organizational framework to monitor the outcomes of our work moving forward, really integrated into the rest of the state's climate planning process. So that's the first proposal we wanted to share with you today. Let's move to the second. We also wanted to propose some additional equity recommendations for the Climate Council. As you've had the chance to review, and as we'll discuss at our next meeting, we've recommended several cross-cutting goals and strategies for procedural equity. These goals are intended to allow for meaningful participation in climate-related policy development, planning, and implementation, and to help ensure really that disadvantaged communities are aware of and can access state programs and funding opportunities for climate action. Stepping back again, it's just important to recognize, Maine Won't Wait was developed with the input of hundreds of Maine people, ensuring a plan that reflects both the best science available to respond to climate change, as well as the priorities of communities around the state. However, we as the Equity Subcommittee have identified several actions to increase participation by priority populations. We recognize that members of disadvantaged, low-income, rural, and frontline communities may face challenges to participating in climate planning and to decision-making, funding, and programs. That is really the body of our work. So in addition to incorporating recommendations from our procedural equity chapter, we propose the following additional equity guidelines for the Climate Council and its working groups moving forward. The first is to incorporate equity training into orientation for all Climate Council and working group members in advance of the next climate planning process. The second is to identify additional opportunities to hear from priority populations and communities, which might include storytelling, listening sessions, or increased opportunities for statewide, virtual, and in-person participation in the state's climate planning process. This work is proposed to be supported by the Equity Subcommittee advisors that I just mentioned. The third additional recommendation is to establish a mechanism for formal consultation with the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations. We propose that this formal mechanism be conducted by the Equity Subcommittee advisors on behalf of the Climate Council and inform recommendations about meaningful involvement for the Climate Council. Next, we recommend developing really good decision tools and guidance to formalize the process by which each working group considers and responds to equity concerns throughout the next climate planning process. And my team would likely support that work. We also recommend that the Council and its working groups seek to achieve greater than proportional representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color persons and other priority populations in their memberships over time. And finally, we recommend that the Council explore opportunities to offer reimbursement of expenses for impacted members of working groups, which is currently allowed for Council members only. Gabriella and Ambassador Dana both thought that these proposals help the Climate Council continue to be accountable to those Maine people who can benefit most from climate actions. I think the proposed structure of the subcommittee that I just shared will help us focus on equity and integrate it into the next climate planning process. With that, I'd like to take just clarifying questions about these two proposals, recognizing that conversation about them will be one of the agenda items at our next meeting. Any clarifying questions from the working group? I also like clarifying thumbs up, so thanks, Becca. Okay, oh, sorry, Carol.
Oh, we're good.
Okay, then I want to bring us to our final slide here and talk a little bit about next steps. As I mentioned a few times, and as I wanted to say here again, we will post the recording of this meeting likely later today or tomorrow morning. Along with the slide deck, which is already posted online, these materials will be available for public comment, which we'll be accepting through January 6th. We've set up a form for members of the public to be able to provide comments. If members of the public prefer, you can also email your comments to me or request a meeting with me if you prefer to share your feedback verbally. After the public comment period, we will share de-identified comments in the full draft report with Equity Subcommittee members for final review. This will happen in the middle weeks in January in advance of our final meeting as a subcommittee on this body of work. Thanks to everyone for filling out the poll for our final meeting, which we've been able to set the date for January 30th from 3 to 5 p.m. At this meeting, we will do our best to summarize any further feedback you have on the full report, to discuss any public comments, to discuss procedural equity, and we'll move to adopt our report to transmit to the Climate Council. Then it goes to the Climate Council for consideration, again, in probably their first meeting early next year. With that, I want to just pull down the slides, see if there are any final questions or comments about this process or what we have kind of on deck in advance of our next and final meeting in this iteration of our work. Seeing none, I'll turn it over to Carol for any further comments she might have.
All I can say is thank you. And we look forward to seeing you in late January. And that's it. And the happiest of holidays, including solstice.